Chapter 10 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 10. But who in this wild wood may credit give to either eye or ear? From rocky precipice or hollow cave, midst the confused sound of rustling leaves, and creaking boughs, and cries of nightly birds, returning seeming answer. Joanna Baihie, Rainer, A Tragedy. 2, lines 3 through 4, 6 through G. Fear, as much as calculation, had induced Hetty to cease paddling, when she found that her pursuers did not know in which direction to proceed. She remained stationary until the Ark had pulled in near the encampment, as has been related in the preceding chapter, when she resumed the paddle and with cautious strokes made the best of her way towards the western shore. In order to avoid her pursuers, however, who she rightly suspected would soon be rowing along that shore themselves, the head of the canoe was pointed so far north as to bring her to land on a point that thrust itself into the lake, at the distance of near a league from the outlet. Nor was this altogether the result of a desire to escape, for, feeble-minded as she was, Hetty Hutter had a good deal of that instinctive caution which so often keeps those whom God has thus visited from harm. She was perfectly aware of the importance of keeping the canoes from falling into the hands of the Iroquois, and long familiarity with the lake had suggested one of the simplest expedients by which this great object could be rendered compatible with her own purpose. The point in question was the first projection that offered on that side of the lake, where a canoe, if set adrift with a southerly air, would float clear of the land, and where it would be no great violation of probabilities to suppose it might even hit the castle, the latter lying above it, almost in a direct line with the wind. Such, then, was Hetty's intention, and she landed on the extremity of the gravelly point, beneath an overhanging oak, with the express intention of shoving the canoe off from the shore, in order that it might drift up towards her father's insulated abode. She knew, too, from the logs that occasionally floated about the lake, that did it miss the castle and its appendages, the wind would be likely to change before the canoe could reach the northern extremity of the lake, and that Deerslayer might have an opportunity of regaining it in the morning, when no doubt he would be earnestly sweeping the surface of the water, and the whole of its wooded shores, with glass. In all this, too, Hetty was less governed by any chain of reasoning than by her habits, the latter often supplying the place of mind, in human beings, as they perform the same for animals of the inferior classes. The girl was quite an hour finding her way to the point, the distance and the obscurity equally detaining her, but she was no sooner on the gravelly beach than she prepared to set the canoe adrift, in the manner mentioned. While in the act of pushing it from her, she heard low voices that seemed to come among the trees behind her. Startled at this unexpected danger, Hetty was on the point of springing into the canoe in order to seek safety in flight, when she thought she recognized the tones of Judith's melodious voice. Bending forward so as to catch the sounds more directly, they evidently came from the water, and then she understood that the Ark was approaching from the south, and so close in with the western shore, as necessarily to cause it to pass the point within 20 yards of the spot where she stood. Here, then, was all she could desire. The canoe was shoved off into the lake, leaving its late occupant alone on the narrow strand. When this act of self-devotion was performed, Hetty did not retire. The foliage of the overhanging trees and bushes would have almost concealed her person, had there been light, but in that obscurity it was utterly impossible to discover any object thus shaded, at the distance of a few feet. Flight, too, was perfectly easy, as 20 steps would effectually bury her in the forest. She remained, therefore, watching with intense anxiety the result of her expedient, intending to call the attention of the others to the canoe with her voice, should they appear to pass without observing it. The Ark approached under its sail, again Deerslayer standing in its bow, with Judith near him, and the Delaware at the helm. It would seem that in the bay below it had got too close to the shore, in the lingering hope of intercepting Hetty, for, as it came nearer, the latter distinctly heard the directions that the young man forward gave to his companion aft, in order to clear the point. "Lay her head more off the shore, Delaware," said Deerslayer, for the third time, speaking in English that his fair companion might understand his words. "Lay her head well off shore. We have got embayed here, and needs keep the mast clear of the trees. Judith, there's a canoe!" The last words were uttered with great earnestness, and Deerslayer's hand was on his rifle ere they were fairly out of his mouth. But the truth flashed on the mind of the quick-witted girl, and she instantly told her companion that the boat must be that in which her sister had fled. "Keep the scow straight, Delaware. Steer as straight as your bullet flies when sent ag'in a buck. There, I have it." The canoe was seized, and immediately secured again to the side of the Ark. At the next moment the sail was lowered, and the motion of the Ark arrested by means of the oars. "Hetty!" called out Judith, concern, even affection, betraying itself in her tones. "Are you within hearing, sister? For God's sake, answer, and let me hear the sound of your voice, again. Hetty! Dear Hetty!" "I'm here, Judith, here on the shore, where it will be useless to follow me, as I will hide in the woods." "Oh, Hetty! What is it you do? Remember 'tis drawing near midnight, and that the woods are filled with savages and wild beasts." "Neither will harm a poor half-witted girl, Judith. God is as much with me here as he would be in the Ark or in the hut. I am going to help my father, and poor Hurry Harry, who will be tortured and slain unless some one cares for them." "We all care for them, and intend to morrow to send them a flag of truce, to buy their ransom. Come back then, sister. Trust to us, who have better heads than you, and who will do all we can for father." "I know your head is better than mine, Judith, for mine is very weak, to be sure. But I must go to father and poor Hurry. Do you and Deerslayer keep the castle, sister. Leave me in the hands of God." "God is with us all, Hetty, in the castle or on the shore, father as well as ourselves, and it is sinful not to trust to his goodness. You can do nothing in the dark. Will lose your way in the forest, and perish for want of food." "God will not let that happen to a poor child that goes to serve her father, sister. I must try and find the savages." "Come back, for this night only. In the morning we will put you ashore, and leave you to do as you may think right." "You say so, Judith, and you think so, but you would not. Your heart would soften, and you'd see tomahawks and scalping knives in the air. Besides, I've got a thing to tell the Indian chief that will answer all our wishes, and I'm afraid I may forget it if I don't tell it to him at once. You'll see that he will let father go, as soon as he hears it." "Poor Hetty! What can you say to a ferocious savage that will be likely to change his bloody purpose?" "That which will frighten him, and make him let father go," returned the simple-minded girl, positively. "You'll see, sister, you'll see how soon it will bring him to, like a gentle child." "Will you tell me, Hetty, what you intend to say?" asked Deerslayer. "I know the savages well, and can form some idee how far fair words will likely, or not, to work on their bloody natur's. If it's not suited to the gifts of a red skin, 'twill be of no use, for reason goes by gifts, as well as conduct." "Well, then," answered Hetty, dropping her voice to a low, confidential tone, for the stillness of the night and the nearness of the Ark permitted her to do this and still to be heard. "Well, then, Deerslayer, as you seem a good and honest young man, I will tell you. I mean not to say a word to any of the savages until I get face to face with their head chief. Let them plague me with as many questions as they please, I'll answer none of them, unless it be to tell them to lead me to their wisest man. Then, Deerslayer, I'll tell him that God will not forgive murder, and thefts; and that if father and Hurry did go after the scalps of the Iroquois, he must return good for evil, for so the Bible commands, else he will go into everlasting punishment. When he hears this, and feels it to be true, as feel it he must, how long will it be before he sends father and Hurry and me to the shore, opposite the castle, telling us all three to go our way in peace?" The last question was put in a triumphant manner, and then the simple-minded girl laughed at the impression she never doubted that her project had made on her auditors. Deerslayer was dumbfounded at this proof of guileless feebleness of mind, But Judith had suddenly bethought her of a means of counteracting this wild project, by acting on the very feelings that had given it birth. Without adverting to the closing question, or the laugh, therefore, she hurriedly called to her sister by name, as one suddenly impressed with the call of what she had to say. But no answer was given to the call. By the snapping of twigs, and the rustling of leaves, Hetty had evidently quitted the shore, and was already burying herself in the forest. To follow would have been fruitless, since the darkness, as well as the dense cover that the woods everywhere offered, would have rendered her capture next to impossible, and there was also the never-ceasing danger of falling into the hands of their enemies. After a short and melancholy discussion, therefore, the sail was again set, and the Ark pursued its course toward its habitual moorings, Deerslayer silently felicitating himself on the recovery of the canoe, and brooding over his plans for the morrow. The wind rose as the party quitted the point, and in less than an hour they reached the castle. Here all was found as it had been left, and the reverse of the ceremonies had to be taken in entering the building that had been used on quitting it. Judith occupied a solitary bed that night, bedewing the pillow with her tears, as she thought of the innocent and hitherto neglected creature, who had been her companion from childhood, and bitter regrets came over her mind, from more causes than one, as the weary hours passed away, making it nearly morning before she lost her recollection in sleep. Deerslayer and the Delaware took their rest in the Ark, where we shall leave them enjoying the deep sleep of the honest, the healthful, and fearless, to return to the girl we have last seen in the midst of the forest. When Hetty left the shore, she took her way unhesitatingly into the woods, with a nervous apprehension of being followed. Luckily, this course was the best she could have hit on to effect her own purpose, since it was the only one that led her from the point. The night was so intensely dark, beneath the branches of the trees, that her progress was very slow, and the direction she went altogether a matter of chance, after the first few yards. The formation of the ground, however, did not permit her to deviate far from the line in which she desired to proceed. On one hand it was soon bounded by the acclivity of the hill, while the lake on the other served as a guide. For 2 hours did this single-hearted and simple-minded girl toil through the mazes of the forest, sometimes finding herself on the brow of the bank that bounded the water, and at others struggling up an ascent that warned her to go no farther in that direction, since it necessarily ran at right angles to the course on which she wished to proceed. Her feet often slid from beneath her, and she got many falls, though none to do her injury. But, by the end of the period mentioned, she had become so weary as to want strength to go any farther. Rest was indispensable, and she set about preparing a bed with the readiness and coolness of one to whom the wilderness presented no unnecessary terrors. She knew that wild beasts roamed through all the adjacent forest, but animals that preyed on the human species were rare, and of dangerous serpents there were literally none. These facts had been taught her by her father, and whatever her feeble mind received at all, it received so confidingly as to leave her no uneasiness from any doubts, or skepticism. To her the sublimity of the solitude in which she was placed was soothing, rather than appalling, and she gathered a bed of leaves, with as much indifference to the circumstances that would have driven the thoughts of sleep entirely from the minds of most of her sex, as if she had been preparing her place of nightly rest beneath the paternal roof. As soon as Hetty had collected a sufficient number of the dried leaves to protect her person from the damps of the ground, she kneeled beside the humble pile, clasped her raised hands in an attitude of deep devotion, and in a soft, low, but audible voice repeated the Lord's Prayer. This was followed by those simple and devout verses, so familiar to children, in which she recommended her soul to God, should it be called away to another state of existence, ere the return of morning. This duty done, she lay down and disposed herself to sleep. The attire of the girl, though suited to the season, was sufficiently warm for all ordinary purposes, but the forest is ever cool, and the nights of that elevated region of country have always a freshness about them that renders clothing more necessary than is commonly the case in summers of a low latitude. This had been foreseen by Hetty, who had brought with her a coarse heavy mantle, which, when laid over her body, answered all the useful purposes of a blanket. Thus protected, she dropped asleep in a few minutes, as tranquilly as if watched over by the guardian care of that mother who had so recently been taken from her forever, affording in this particular a most striking contrast between her own humble couch and the sleepless pillow of her sister. Hour passed after hour, in a tranquillity as undisturbed and a rest as sweet as if angels, expressly commissioned for that object, watched around the bed of Hetty Hutter. Not once did her soft eyes open until the gray of the dawn came struggling through the tops of the trees, falling on their lids, and united to the freshness of a summer's morning, given the usual summons to awake. Ordinarily, Hetty was up ere the rays of the sun tipped the summits of the mountains, but on this occasion her fatigue had been so great, and her rest was so profound, that the customary warnings failed of their effect. The girl murmured in her sleep, threw an arm forward, smiled as gently as an infant in its cradle, but still slumbered. In making this unconscious gesture, her hand fell on some object that was warm, and in the half unconscious state in which she lay, she connected the circumstance with her habits. At the next moment, a rude attack was made on her side, as if a rooting animal were thrusting its snout beneath, with a desire to force her position, and then, uttering the name of Judith, she awoke. As the startled girl arose to a sitting attitude, she perceived that some dark object sprang from her, scattering the leaves and snapping the fallen twigs in its haste. Opening her eyes, and recovering from the first confusion and astonishment of her situation, Hetty perceived a cub of the common American brown bear, balancing itself on its hinder legs, and still looking towards her, as if doubtful whether it would be safe to trust itself near her person again. The first impulse of Hetty, who had been mistress of several of these cubs, was to run and seize the little creature as a prize, but a loud growl warned her of the danger of such a procedure. Recoiling a few steps, the girl looked hurriedly round, and perceived the dam, watching her movements with fiery eyes at no great distance. A hollow tree, that once had been the home of bees, having recently fallen, the mother with 2 more cubs was feasting on the dainty food that this accident had placed within her reach, while the first kept a jealous eye on the situation of its truant and reckless young. It would exceed all the means of human knowledge to presume to analyze the influences that govern the acts of the lower animals. On this occasion, the dam, though proverbially fierce when its young is thought to be in danger, manifested no intention to attack the girl. It quitted the honey, and advanced to a place within 20 feet of her, where it raised itself on its hind legs and balanced its body in a sort of angry, growling discontent, but approached no nearer. Happily, Hetty did not fly. On the contrary, though not without terror, she knelt with her face towards the animal, and with clasped hands and uplifted eyes repeated the prayer of the previous night. This act of devotion was not the result of alarm, but it was a duty she never neglected to perform ere she slept, and when the return of consciousness awoke her to the business of the day. As the girl arose from her knees, the bear dropped on its feet again, and collecting its cubs around her, permitted them to draw their natural sustenance. Hetty was delighted with this proof of tenderness in an animal that has but a very different reputation for the gentler feelings, and as a cub would quit his mother to frisk and leap about in wantonness, she felt a strong desire again to catch it up in her arms, and play with it. But admonished by the growl, she had self-command sufficient not to put this dangerous project in execution, and recollecting her errand among the hills, she tore herself away from the group, and proceeded on her course along the margin of the lake, of which she now caught glimpses again through the trees. To her surprise, though not to her alarm, the family of bears arose and followed her steps, keeping a short distance behind her, apparently watching every movement, as if they had a near interest in all she did. In this manner, escorted by the dam and cubs, the girl proceeded nearly a mile, thrice the distance she had been able to achieve in the darkness, during the same period of time. She then reached a brook that had dug a channel for itself into the earth, and went brawling into the lake between steep and high banks, covered with trees. Here Hetty performed her ablutions. Then, drinking of the pure mountain water, she went her way, refreshed and lighter of heart, still attended by her singular companions. Her course now lay along a broad and nearly level terrace, which stretched from the top of the bank that bounded the water to a low acclivity that rose to a second and irregular platform above. This was at a part of the valley where the mountains ran obliquely, forming the commencement of a plain that spread between the hills, southward of the sheet of water. Hetty knew, by this circumstance, that she was getting near to the encampment, and had she not, the bears would have given her warning of the vicinity of human beings. Snuffing the air, the dam refused to follow any further, though the girl looked back and invited her to come by childish signs, and even by direct appeals made in her own sweet voice. It was while making her way slowly through some bushes, in this manner, with averted face, and eyes riveted on the immovable animals, that the girl suddenly found her steps arrested by a human hand, that was laid lightly on her shoulder. "Where go?" said a soft female voice, speaking hurriedly, and in concern. "Indian red man savage wicked warrior that-a-way." This unexpected salutation alarmed the girl no more than the presence of the fierce inhabitants of the woods. It took her a little by surprise, it is true, but she was in a measure prepared for some such meeting, and the creature who stopped her was as little likely to excite terror as any who ever appeared in the guise of an Indian. It was a girl, not much older than herself, whose smile was sunny as Judith's in her brightest moments, whose voice was melody itself, and whose accents and manner had all the rebuked gentleness that characterizes the sex among a people who habitually treat their women as the attendants and servitors of the warriors. Beauty among the women of the aboriginal Americans, before they have become exposed to the hardships of wives and mothers, is by no means uncommon. In this particular, the original owners of the country were not unlike their more civilized successors, nature appearing to have bestowed that delicacy of mien and outline that forms so great a charm in the youthful female, but of which they are so early deprived; and that, too, as much by the habits of domestic life as from any other cause. The girl who had so suddenly arrested the steps of Hetty was dressed in a calico mantle that effectually protected all the upper part of her person, while a short petticoat of blue cloth, edged with gold lace, that fell no lower than her knees, leggings of the same, and moccasins of deerskin, completed her attire. Her hair fell in long dark braids down her shoulders and back, and was parted above a low smooth forehead, in a way to soften the expression of eyes that were full of archness and natural feeling. Her face was oval, with delicate features, the teeth were even and white, while the mouth expressed a melancholy tenderness, as if it wore this peculiar meaning in intuitive perception of the fate of a being who was doomed from birth to endure a woman's sufferings, relieved by a woman's affections. Her voice, as has been already intimated, was soft as the sighing of the night air, a characteristic of the females of her race, but which was so conspicuous in herself as to have produced for her the name of Wah-ta-Wah, which rendered into English means Hist-o-Hist. In a word, this was the betrothed of Chingachgook, who, having succeeded in lulling their suspicions, was permitted to wander around the encampment of her captors. This indulgence was in accordance with the general policy of the red man, who well knew, moreover, that her trail could have been easily followed in the event of flight. It will also be remembered that the Iroquois, or Hurons, as would be better to call them, were entirely ignorant of the proximity of her lover, a fact, indeed, that she did not know herself. It is not easy to say which manifested the most self-possession at this unexpected meeting, the pale face or the red girl. But, though a little surprised, Wah-ta-Wah was the most willing to speak, and far the readier in foreseeing consequences, as well as in devising means to avert them. Her father, during her childhood, had been much employed as a warrior by the authorities of the colony, and dwelling for several years near the forts, she had caught a knowledge of the English tongue, which she spoke in the usual abbreviated manner of an Indian, but fluently, and without any of the ordinary reluctance of her people. "Where go?" repeated Wah-ta-Wah, returning the smile of Hetty in her own gentle, winning manner. "Wicked warrior that-a-way good warrior far off." "What's your name?" asked Hetty, with the simplicity of a child. "Wah-ta-Wah. I know Mingo. Good Delaware. Yengeese friend. Mingo cruel, and love scalp, for blood. Delaware love him for honor. Come here, where no eyes." Wah-ta-Wah now led her companion towards the lake, descending the bank so as to place its overhanging trees and bushes between them and any probable observers. Nor did she stop until they were both seated, side by side, on a fallen log, one end of which actually lay buried in the water. "Why you come for?" the young Indian eagerly inquired. "Where you come for?" Hetty told her tale in her own simple and truth-loving manner. She explained the situation of her father, and stated her desire to serve him, and if possible to procure his release. "Why your father come to Mingo camp in night?" asked the Indian girl, with a directness, which, if not borrowed from the other, partook largely of its sincerity. "He know it war time, and he no boy, he no want beard, no want to be told Iroquois carry tomahawk, and knife, and rifle. Why he come night time, seize me by hair, and try to scalp Delaware girl." "You!" said Hetty, almost sickening with horror. "Did he seize you? Did he try to scalp you?" "Why no. Delaware scalp sell for much as Mingo scalp. Governor no tell difference. Wicked ting for pale face to scalp. No his gifts, as the good Deerslayer always tell me." "And do you know the Deerslayer?" said Hetty, coloring with delight and surprise, forgetting her regrets, at the moment, in the influence of this new feeling. "I know him too. He is now in the Ark, with Judith and a Delaware who was called the Big Serpent. A bold and handsome warrior is this Serpent, too." Spite of the rich, deep color that nature had bestowed on the Indian beauty, the tell-tale blood deepened on her cheeks, until the blush gave new animation and intelligence to her jet-black eyes. Raising a finger in an attitude of warning, she dropped her voice, already so soft and sweet, nearly to a whisper, as she continued the discourse. "Chingachgook," returned the Delaware girl, sighing out the harsh name in sounds so softly guttural as to cause it to reach the ear in melody. "His father, great chief of the Mahikani, next to old Tamenund, more as warrior, not so much gray hair and less at council fire. You know Serpent?" "He joined us last evening, and was in the Ark with me for 2 or 3 hours before I left it. I'm afraid, Hist," Hetty could not pronounce the Indian name of her new friend, but having heard Deerslayer give her this familiar appellation, she used it without any of the ceremony of civilized life. "I'm afraid, Hist, he has come after scalps, as well as my poor father and Hurry Harry." "Why he shouldn't? Ha! Chingachgook great warrior, very red scalp make his honor. Be sure he take him." "Then," said Hetty, earnestly, "he will be as wicked as any other. God will not pardon a red man, what he will not pardon in a white man." "No true," returned the Delaware girl, with a warmth that nearly amounted to passion. "No true. I tell you, the Manitou smile and pleased when he see young warrior come back from the war path, with 2-10 scalp on a pole. Chingachgook father take scalp, grandfather take scalp, all old chief take scalp, and Chingachgook take as many scalp as he can carry himself. Then, Hist, his sleep of nights must be terrible to think of. No one can be cruel, and hope to be forgiven." "No cruel plenty forgiven," returned Wah-ta-Wah, stamping her little foot on the stony strand, and shaking her head in a way to show how completely feminine feeling, in one of its aspects, had gotten the better of feminine feeling in another. "I tell you, Serpent brave. He go home, this time, with 4, yes, 2 scalp." "And is that his errand here? Did he really come all this distance, across mountain and valley, rivers and lakes, to torment his fellow creatures, and do so wicked a thing?" This question at once appeased the growing ire of the half-offended Indian beauty. It completely got the better of the prejudices of education, and turned all her thoughts to a gentler and more feminine channel. At first she looked around her, suspiciously, as if distrusting eavesdroppers. Then she gazed wistfully into the face of her attentive companion, after which this exhibition of girlish coquetry and womanly feeling terminated by her covering her face with both her hands, and laughing in a strain that might well be termed the melody of the woods. Dread of discovery, however, soon put a stop to this naive exhibition of feeling, and removing her hands, this creature of impulses gazed again wistfully into the face of her companion, as if inquiring how far she might trust a stranger with her secret. Although Hetty had no claims to her sister's extraordinary beauty, many thought her countenance the most winning of the two. It expressed all the undisguised sincerity of her character, and it was totally free from any of the unpleasant physical accompaniments that so frequently attend mental imbecility. It is true that one accustomed to closer observations than common might have detected the proofs of her feebleness of intellect in the language of her sometimes vacant eyes, but they were signs that attracted sympathy by their total want of guile, rather than by any other feeling. The effect on Hist, to use the English and more familiar translation of the name, was favorable, and yielding to an impulse of tenderness, she threw her arms around Hetty, and embraced her with an outpouring emotion so natural that it was only equalled by its warmth. "You good," whispered the young Indian. "You good. I know. It's so long since Wah-ta-Wah have a friend, a sister, anybody to speak her heart to. You Hist friend. Don't I say trut?" "I never had a friend," answered Hetty, returning the warm embrace with unfeigned earnestness. "I've a sister, but no friend. Judith loves me, and I love Judith, but that's natural, and as we are taught in the Bible. But I should like to have a friend. I'll be your friend, with all my heart, for I like your voice and your smile, and your way of thinking in everything, except about the scalps." "No t'ink more of him, no say more of scalp," interrupted Hist, soothingly. "You pale face, I red skin. We bring up different fashion. Deerslayer and Chingachgook great friend, and know the same color. Hist and what your name, pretty pale face?" "I am called Hetty, though when they spell the name in the Bible, they always spell it Esther." "What that make? No good, no harm. No need to spell name at all. Moravian try to make Wah-ta-Wah spell, but no won't let him. No good for Delaware girl to know too much, know more than warrior sometime. That great shame. My name Wah-ta-Wah, that say Hist in your tongue. You call him Hist, I call him Hetty." These preliminaries settled to their mutual satisfaction, the two girls began to discourse of their several hopes and projects. Hetty made her new friend more fully acquainted with her intentions in behalf of her father, and, to one in the least addicted to prying into the affairs, Hist would have betrayed her own feelings and expectations in connection with the young warrior of her own tribe. Enough was revealed on both sides, however, to let each party get a tolerable insight into the views of the other, though enough still remained in mental reservation to give rise to the following questions and answers, with which the interview in effect closed. As the quickest witted, Hist was the first with her interrogatories. Folding an arm about the waist of Hetty, she bent her head so as to look up playfully into the face of the other, and, laughing, as if her meaning were to be extracted from her looks, she spoke more plainly. "Hetty got brudder as well as fader?" she said. "Why no talk of brudder as well as fader?" "I have no brother, Hist. I had one once, they say, but he is dead many a year, and lies buried in the lake, by the side of my mother." "No got brudder? Got a young warrior? Love him almost as much as fader, eh? Very handsome, and brave looking, fit to be chief, if he good as he seem to be." "It's wicked to love any man as well as I love my father, and so I strive not to do it, Hist," returned the conscientious Hetty, who knew not how to conceal an emotion, by an approach to an untruth as venial as an evasion, though powerfully tempted by female shame to err. "Though I sometimes think wickedness will get the better of me, if Hurry comes so often to the lake. I must tell you the truth, dear Hist, because you ask me, but I should fall down and die in the woods if he knew it." "Why he no ask you himself? Brave looking, why not bold speaking? Young warrior ought to ask young girl, no make young girl speak first. Mingo girls too shame for that." This was said indignantly, and with the generous warmth a young female of spirit would be apt to feel, at what she deemed an invasion of her sex's most valued privilege. It had little influence on the simple-minded, but also just-minded, Hetty, who, though inherently feminine in all her impulses, was much more alive to the workings of her own heart than to any of the usages with which convention has protected the sensitiveness of her sex. "Ask me what?" the startled girl demanded, with a suddenness that proved how completely her fears had been aroused. "Ask me if I like him as well as I do my own father? Oh, I hope he will never put such a question to me, for I should have to answer, and that would kill me." "No, no, no kill. Quite, almost," returned the other, laughing in spite of herself. "Make blush come. Make shame come, too. But he no stay great while, then feel happier than ever. Young warrior must tell young girl he want to make wife, else never can live in his wigwam." "Hurry don't want to marry me. Nobody will ever want to marry me, Hist." "How can you know? P'raps everybody want to marry you, and by tongue say what heart feel. Why nobody want to marry you?" "I am not full-witted, they say. Father often tells me this, and so does Judith, sometimes, when she is vexed. But I shouldn't so much mind them, as I did mother. She said so once, and then she cried as if her heart would break, and so I know I'm not full-witted." Hist gazed at the gentle, simple girl for quite a minute without speaking, and then the truth appeared to flash all at once on the mind of the young Indian maid. Pity, reverence, and tenderness seemed struggling together in her breast. And then rising suddenly, she indicated a wish to her companion that she would accompany her to the camp, which was situated at no great distance. This unexpected change, from the precautions that Hist had previously manifested a desire to use, in order to prevent being seen, to an open exposure of the person of her friend, arose from the perfect conviction that no Indian would harm a being whom the Great Spirit had disarmed, by depriving it of its strongest defence, reason. In this respect, nearly all unsophisticated nations resemble each other, appearing to offer spontaneously, by a feeling creditable to human nature, that protection by their own forbearance, which has been withheld by the inscrutable wisdom of Providence. Wah-ta-Wah, indeed, knew that in many tribes the mentally imbecile and the mad were held in a species of religious reverence, receiving from these untutored inhabitants of the forest respect and honors, instead of the contumely and neglect that it is their fortune to meet with among the more pretending and sophisticated. Hetty accompanied her new friend without apprehension or reluctance. It was her wish to reach the camp, and, sustained by her motives, she felt no more concern for the consequences than did her companion herself, now the latter was apprised of the character of the protection that the pale-face maiden carried with her. Still, as they proceeded slowly along a shore that was tangled with overhanging bushes, Hetty continued the discourse, assuming the office of interrogating which the other had instantly dropped, as soon as she ascertained the character of the mind to which her questions had been addressed. "But you are not half-witted," said Hetty, "and there's no reason why the Serpent should not marry you." "Hist prisoner, and Mingo got big ear. No speak of Chingachgook when they by. Promise Hist that, good Hetty." I know," returned Hetty, half whispering, in her eagerness to let the other see she understood the necessity of caution. "I know, Deerslayer and the Serpent mean to get you away from the Iroquois, and you wish me not to tell the secret." "How you know?" said Hist, hastily, vexed at the moment that the other was not even more feeble-minded than was actually the case. "How you know? Better not talk of any but fader and Hurry. Mingo understand dat. He no understand t'udder. Promise you no talk about what you no understand." "But I do understand this, Hist, and so I must talk about it. Deerslayer as good as told father all about it, in my presence, and as nobody told me not to listen, I overheard it all, as I did Hurry and father's discourse about the scalps." "Very bad for pale-faces to talk about scalps, and very bad for young woman to hear. Now you love Hist, I know, Hetty, and so, among Injins, when love hardest, never talk most." "That's not the way among white people, who talk most about them they love best. I suppose it's because I'm only half-witted that I don't see the reason why it should be so different among red people." "That what Deerslayer call gift. One gift to talk, t'udder gift to hold tongue. Hold tongue your gift among Mingos. If Sarpent want to see Hist, so Hetty want to see Hurry. Good girl never tell secret of friend." Hetty understood this appeal, and she promised the Delaware girl not to make any allusion to the presence of Chingachgook, or to the motive of his visit to the lake. "Maybe he get off Hurry and fader, as well as Hist, if let him have his way," whispered Wah-ta-Wah to her companion, in a confiding, flattering way, just as they got near enough to the encampment to hear the voices of several of their own sex, who were apparently occupied in the usual toils of women of their class. "Tink of dat, Hetty, and put 20 finger on mouth. No get friend free without Serpent do it." A better expedient could not have been adopted, to secure the silence and discretion of Hetty, than that which was now presented to her mind. As the liberation of her father and the young frontier man was the great object of her adventure, she felt the connection between it and the services of the Delaware, and with an innocent laugh she nodded her head, and in the same suppressed manner promised a due attention to the wishes of her friend. Thus assured, Hist tarried no longer, but immediately and openly led the way into the encampment of her captors. End of chapter 10. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 11 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 11. The great King of kings hath in the table of his law commanded that thou shalt do no murder. Take heed, for he holds vengeance in his hand, to hurl upon their heads that break his law. Richard III, Act 1, Scene 4, lines 195 to 197, and 199 to 200. That the party to which Hist compulsorily belonged was not one that was regularly on the war-path, was evident by the presence of females. It was a small fragment of a tribe that had been hunting and fishing within the English limits, where it was found by the commencement of hostilities, and after passing the winter and spring by living on what was strictly the property of its enemies, it chose to strike a hostile blow before it finally retired. There was also deep Indian sagacity in the manoeuvre which had led them so far into the territory of their foes. When the runner arrived who announced the breaking out of hostilities between the English and French, a struggle that was certain to carry with it all the tribes that dwelt within the influence of the respective belligerents, this particular party of the Iroquois were posted on the shores of the Oneida, a lake that lies some 50 miles nearer to their own frontier than that which is the scene of our tale. To have fled in a direct line for the Canadas would have exposed them to the dangers of a direct pursuit, and the chiefs had determined to adopt the expedient of penetrating deeper into a region that had now become dangerous, in the hope of being able to retire in the rear of their pursuers, instead of having them on their trail. The presence of the women had induced the attempt at this ruse, the strength of these feebler members of the party being unequal to the effort of escaping from the pursuit of warriors. When the reader remembers the vast extent of the American wilderness at that early day, he will perceive that it was possible for even a tribe to remain months undiscovered in particular portions of it, nor was the danger of encountering a foe, the usual precautions being observed, as great in the woods, as it is on the high seas in a time of active warfare. The encampment being temporary, it offered to the eye no more than the rude protection of a bivouac, relieved in some slight degree by the ingenious expedients which suggested themselves to the readiness of those who passed their lives amid similar scenes. One fire that had been kindled against the roots of a living oak sufficed for the whole party, the weather being too mild to require it for any purpose but cooking. Scattered around this centre of attraction were some 15 or 20 low huts, or perhaps kennels would be a better word, into which their different owners crept at night, and which were also intended to meet the exigencies of a storm. These little huts were made of the branches of trees, put together with some ingenuity, and they were uniformly topped with bark that had been stripped from fallen trees, of which every virgin forest possesses hundreds, in all stages of decay. Of furniture they had next to none. Cooking utensils of the simplest sort were lying near the fire. A few articles of clothing were to be seen in or around the huts. Rifles, horns, and pouches leaned against the trees, or were suspended from the lower branches, and the carcasses of 2 or 3 deer were stretched to view on the same natural shambles. As the encampment was in the midst of a dense wood, the eye could not take in its tout ensemble at a glance, but hut after hut started out of the gloomy picture, as one gazed about him in quest of objects. There was no centre, unless the fire might be so considered, no open area where the possessors of this rude village might congregate, but all was dark, covert, and cunning, like its owners. A few children strayed from hut to hut, giving the spot a little of the air of domestic life, and the suppressed laugh and low voices of the women occasionally broke in upon the deep stillness of the sombre forest. As for the men, they either ate, slept, or examined their arms. They conversed but little, and then usually apart, or in groups withdrawn from the females, whilst an air of untiring, innate watchfulness and apprehension of danger seemed to be blended even with their slumbers. As the 2 girls came near the encampment, Hetty uttered a slight exclamation, on catching a view of the person of her father. He was seated on the ground with his back to a tree, and Hurry stood near him indolently whittling a twig. Apparently they were as much at liberty as any others in or about the camp, and one unaccustomed to Indian usages would have mistaken them for visitors, instead of supposing them to be captives. Wah-ta-Wah led her new friend quite near them, and then modestly withdrew, that her own presence might be no restraint on her feelings. But Hetty was not sufficiently familiar with caresses or outward demonstrations of fondness, to indulge in any outbreaking of feeling. She merely approached, and stood at her father's side without speaking, resembling a silent statue of filial affection. The old man expressed neither alarm nor surprise at her sudden appearance. In these particulars he had caught the stoicism of the Indians, well knowing that there was no more certain mode of securing their respect than by imitating their self-command. Nor did the savages themselves betray the least sign of surprise at this sudden appearance of a stranger among them. In a word, this arrival produced much less visible sensation, though occurring under circumstances so peculiar than would be seen in a village of higher pretensions to civilization, did an ordinary traveller drive up to the door of its principal inn. Still a few warriors collected, and it was evident by the manner in which they glanced at Hetty as they conversed together, that she was the subject of their discourse, and probable that the reasons of her unlooked-for appearance were matters of discussion. This phlegm of manner is characteristic of the North American Indian. Some say of his white successor also, but, in this case, much should be attributed to the peculiar situation in which the party was placed. The force in the Ark, the presence of Chingachgook excepted, was well known, no tribe or body of troops was believed to be near, and vigilant eyes were posted round the entire lake, watching day and night the slightest movement of those whom it would not be exaggerated now to term the besieged. Hutter was inwardly much moved by the conduct of Hetty, though he affected so much indifference of manner. He recollected her gentle appeal to him before he left the Ark, and misfortune rendered that of weight which might have been forgotten amid the triumph of success. Then he knew the simple, single-hearted fidelity of his child, and understood why she had come, and the total disregard of self that reigned in all her acts. "This is not well, Hetty," he said, deprecating the consequences to the girl herself more than any other evil. "These are fierce Iroquois, and are as little apt to forget an injury as a favor." "Tell me, father," returned the girl, looking furtively about her as if fearful of being overheard, "did God let you do the cruel errand on which you came? I want much to know this, that I may speak to the Indians plainly, if he did not." "You should not have come hither, Hetty. These brutes will not understand your nature or your intentions." "How was it, father? Neither you nor Hurry seems to have anything that looks like scalps." "If that will set your mind at peace, child, I can answer you, no. I had caught the young creature who came here with you, but her screeches soon brought down upon me a troop of the wild cats. That was too much for any single Christian to withstand. If that will do you any good, we are as innocent of having taken a scalp this time, as I make no doubt we shall also be innocent of receiving the bounty." "Thank God for that, father! Now I can speak boldly to the Iroquois, and with an easy conscience. I hope Hurry, too, has not been able to harm any of the Indians?" "Why, as to that matter, Hetty," returned the individual in question, "you've put it pretty much in the native character of the religious truth. Hurry has not been able, and that is the long and short of it. I've seen many squalls, old fellow, both on land and on the water, but never did I feel one as lively and as snappish as that which come down upon us night afore last, in the shape of an Indian hurrah boys. Why, Hetty, you're no great matter at a reason, or an idee that lies a little deeper than common, but you're human and have some human notions. Now I'll just ask you to look at them circumstances. Here was old Tom, your father, and myself, bent on a legal operation, as is to be seen in the words of the law and the proclamation, thinking no harm, when we were set upon by critters that were more like a pack of hungry wolves than mortal savages even, and there they had us tethered like two sheep, in less time than it has taken me to tell you the story." "You are free now, Hurry," returned Hetty, glancing timidly at the fine unfettered limbs of the young giant. "You have no cords, or withes, to pain your arms or legs now." "Not I, Hetty. Natur' is natur', and freedom is natur' too. My limbs have a free look, but that's pretty much the amount of it, sin' I can't use them in the way I should like. Even these trees have eyes, ay, and tongues too, for was the old man here, or I, to start one single rod beyond our gaol limits, sarvice would be put on the bail afore we could gird up our loins for a race, and, like as not, 4 or 5 rifle bullets would be travelling arter us, carrying so many invitations to curb our impatience. There isn't a gaol in the colony as tight as this we are now in, for I've tried the vartues of 2 or 3 on 'em, and I know the materials they are made of, as well as the men that made 'em, takin' down being the next step in schoolin', to putting up in all such fabrications." Lest the reader should get an exaggerated opinion of Hurry's demerits from this boastful and indiscreet revelation, it may be well to say that his offences were confined to assaults and batteries, for several of which he had been imprisoned, when, as he has just said, he often escaped by demonstrating the flimsiness of the constructions in which he was confined, by opening for himself doors in spots where the architects had neglected to place them. But Hetty had no knowledge of gaols, and little of the nature of crimes, beyond what her unadulterated and almost instinctive perceptions of right and wrong taught her, and this sally of the rude being who had spoken was lost upon her. She understood his general meaning, however, and answered in reference to that alone. "It's so best, Hurry," she said. "It is best father and you should be quiet and peaceable, till I have spoken to the Iroquois, when all will be well and happy. I don't wish either of you to follow, but leave me to myself. As soon as all is settled, and you are at liberty to go back to the castle, I will come and let you know it." Hetty spoke with so much simple earnestness, seemed so confident of success, and wore so high an air of moral feeling and truth, that both the listeners felt more disposed to attach an importance to her mediation than might otherwise have happened. When she manifested an intention to quit them, therefore, they offered no obstacle, though they saw she was about to join the group of chiefs who were consulting apart, seemingly on the manner and motive of her own sudden appearance. When Hist, for so we love best to call her, quitted her companion, she strayed near 1 or 2 of the elder warriors, who had shown her most kindness in her captivity, the principal man of whom had even offered to adopt her as his child if she would consent to become a Huron. In taking this direction, the shrewd girl did so to invite inquiry. She was too well trained in the habits of her people to obtrude the opinions of one of her sex and years on men and warriors, but nature had furnished a tact and ingenuity that enabled her to attract the attention she desired, without wounding the pride of those to whom it was her duty to defer and respect. Even her affected indifference stimulated curiosity, and Hetty had hardly reached the side of her father before the Delaware girl was brought within the circle of the warriors, by a secret but significant gesture. Here she was questioned as to the person of her companion, and the motives that had brought her to the camp. This was all that Hist desired. She explained the manner in which she had detected the weakness of Hetty's reason, rather exaggerating than lessening the deficiency in her intellect, and then she related in general terms the object of the girl in venturing among her enemies. The effect was all that the speaker expected, her account investing the person and character of their visitor with a sacredness and respect that she well knew would prove her protection. As soon as her own purpose was attained, Hist withdrew to a distance, where, with female consideration and a sisterly tenderness, she set about the preparation of a meal, to be offered to her new friend as soon as the latter might be at liberty to partake of it. While thus occupied, however, the ready girl in no degree relaxed her watchfulness, noting every change of countenance among the chiefs, every movement of Hetty's, and the smallest occurrence that could be likely to affect her own interests, or that of her new friend. As Hetty approached the chiefs, they opened their little circle, with an ease and deference of manner that would have done credit to men of more courtly origin. A fallen tree lay near, and the oldest of the warriors made a quiet sign for the girl to be seated on it, taking his place at her side with the gentleness of a father. The others arranged themselves around the two with grave dignity, and then the girl, who had sufficient observation to perceive that such a course was expected of her, began to reveal the object of her visit. The moment she opened her mouth to speak, however, the old chief gave a gentle sign for her to forbear, and said a few words to one of his juniors, and then waited in silent patience until the latter had summoned Hist to the party. This interruption proceeded from the chief's having discovered that there existed a necessity for an interpreter, few of the Hurons present understanding the English language, and they but imperfectly. Wah ta Wah was not sorry to be called upon to be present at the interview, and least of all in the character in which she was now wanted. She was aware of the hazards she ran in attempting to deceive one or two of the party, but was none the less resolved to use every means that offered, and to practice every artifice that an Indian education could supply, to conceal the facts of the vicinity of her betrothed, and of the errand on which he had come. One unpractised in the expedients and opinions of savage life would not have suspected the readiness of invention, the wariness of action, the high resolution, the noble impulses, the deep self-devotion, and the feminine disregard of self when the affections were concerned, that lay concealed beneath the demure looks, the mild eyes, and the sunny smiles of this young Indian beauty. As she approached them, the grim old warriors regarded her with pleasure, for they had a secret pride in the hope of engrafting so rare a scion on the stock of their own nation, adoption being as regularly practised, and as distinctly recognized among the tribes of America, as it ever had been among those nations that submit to the sway of the civil law. As soon as Hist was seated by the side of Hetty, the old chief desired her to ask the fair young pale face what had brought her among the Iroquois, and what they could do to serve her. "Tell them, Hist, who I am, Thomas Hutter's youngest daughter. Thomas Hutter, the oldest of their 2 prisoners. He who owns the castle and the Ark, and who has the best right to be thought the owner of these hills, and that lake, since he has dwelt so long, and trapped so long, and fished so long among them. They'll know whom you mean by Thomas Hutter, if you tell them that. And then tell them that I've come here to convince them they ought not to harm father and Hurry, but let them go in peace, and to treat them as brethren, rather than as enemies. Now tell them all this plainly, Hist, and fear nothing for yourself or me. God will protect us." Wah ta Wah did as the other desired, taking care to render the words of her friend as literally as possible into the Iroquois tongue, a language she used with a readiness almost equal to that with which she spoke her own. The chiefs heard this opening explanation with grave decorum, the 2 who had a little knowledge of English intimating their satisfaction with the interpreter by furtive but significant glances of the eyes. "And now, Hist," continued Hetty, as soon as it was intimated to her that she might proceed. "And now, Hist, I wish you to tell these red men, word for word, what I am about to say. Tell them, first, that father and Hurry came here with an intention to take as many scalps as they could, for the wicked governor and the province have offered money for scalps, whether of warriors or women, men or children, and the love of gold was too strong for their hearts to withstand it. Tell them this, dear Hist, just as you have heard it from me, word for word." Wah-ta-Wah hesitated about rendering this speech as literally as had been desired, but detecting the intelligence of those who understood English, and apprehending even a greater knowledge than they actually possessed, she found herself compelled to comply. Contrary to what a civilized man would have expected, the admission of the motives and of the errands of their prisoners produced no visible effect on either the countenances or the feelings of the listeners. They probably considered the act meritorious, and that which neither of them would have hesitated to perform in his own person, he would not be apt to censure in another. "And now, Hist," resumed Hetty, as soon as she perceived that her first speeches were understood by the chiefs, "you can tell them more. They know that father and Hurry did not succeed, and therefore they can bear them no grudge for any harm that has been done. If they had slain their children and wives it would not alter the matter, and I'm not certain that what I am about to tell them would not have more weight had there been mischief done. But ask them first, Hist, if they know there is a God, who reigns over the whole earth, and is ruler and chief of all who live, let them be red, or white, or what color they may." Wah-ta-Wah looked a little surprised at this question, for the idea of the Great Spirit is seldom long absent from the mind of an Indian girl. She put the question as literally as possible, however, and received a grave answer in the affirmative. "This is right," continued Hetty, "and my duty will now be light. This Great Spirit, as you call our God, has caused a book to be written, that we call a Bible, and in this book have been set down all his commandments, and his holy will and pleasure, and the rules by which all men are to live, and directions how to govern the thoughts even, and the wishes, and the will. Here, this is one of these holy books, and you must tell the chiefs what I am about to read to them from its sacred pages." As Hetty concluded, she reverently unrolled a small English Bible from its envelope of coarse calico, treating the volume with the sort of external respect that a Romanist would be apt to show to a religious relic. As she slowly proceeded in her task, the grim warriors watched each movement with riveted eyes, and when they saw the little volume appear, a slight expression of surprise escaped one or two of them. But Hetty held it out towards them in triumph, as if she expected the sight would produce a visible miracle, and then, without betraying either surprise or mortification at the stoicism of the Indian, she turned eagerly to her new friend, in order to renew the discourse. "This is the sacred volume, Hist," she said, "and these words, and lines, and verses, and chapters, all came from God." "Why Great Spirit no send book to Injin, too?" demanded Hist, with the directness of a mind that was totally unsophisticated. "Why?" answered Hetty, a little bewildered by a question so unexpected. "Why? Ah, you know the Indians don't know how to read." If Hist was not satisfied with this explanation, she did not deem the point of sufficient importance to be pressed. Simply bending her body, in a gentle admission of the truth of what she heard, she sat patiently awaiting the further arguments of the pale-face enthusiast. "You can tell these chiefs that throughout this book men are ordered to forgive their enemies, to treat them as they would brethren, and never to injure their fellow creatures, more especially on account of revenge or any evil passions. Do you think you can tell them this, so that they will understand it, Hist?" "Tell him well enough, but he no very easy to understand." Hist then conveyed the ideas of Hetty, in the best manner she could, to the attentive Indians, who heard her words with some such surprise as an American of our own times would be apt to betray at a suggestion that the great modern but vacillating ruler of things human, public opinion, might be wrong. One or two of their number, however, having met with missionaries, said a few words in explanation, and then the group gave all its attention to the communications that were to follow. Before Hetty resumed, she inquired earnestly of Hist if the chiefs had understood her, and receiving an evasive answer, was fain to be satisfied. "I will now read to the warriors some of the verses that it is good for them to know," continued the girl, whose manner grew more solemn and earnest as she proceeded, "and they will remember that they are the very words of the Great Spirit. First, then, ye are commanded to love thy neighbor as thyself. Tell them that, dear Hist." "Neighbor for Injin, no mean pale face," answered the Delaware girl, with more decision than she had hitherto thought it necessary to use. "Neighbor mean Iroquois for Iroquois, Mohican for Mohican, pale face for pale face. No need tell chief anything else." "You forget, Hist. These are the words of the Great Spirit, and the chiefs must obey them as well as others. Here is another commandment: Whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." "What that mean?" demanded Hist, with the quickness of lightning. Hetty explained that it was an order not to resent injuries, but rather to submit to receive fresh wrongs from the offender. "And hear this too, Hist," she added. "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." By this time Hetty had become excited. Her eye gleamed with the earnestness of her feelings, her cheeks flushed, and her voice, usually so low and modulated, became stronger and more impressive. With the Bible she had been early made familiar by her mother, she now turned from passage to passage with surprising rapidity, taking care to cull such verses as taught the sublime lessons of Christian charity and Christian forgiveness. To translate half she said, in her pious earnestness, Wah ta Wah would have found impracticable, had she made the effort, but wonder held her tongue tied, equally with the chiefs, and the young, simple-minded enthusiast had fairly become exhausted with her own efforts, before the other opened her mouth again to utter a syllable. Then, indeed, the Delaware girl gave a brief translation of the substance of what had been both read and said, confining herself to one or two of the more striking of the verses, those that had struck her own imagination as the most paradoxical, and which certainly would have been the most applicable to the case, could the uninstructed minds of the listeners embrace the great moral truths they conveyed. It will be scarcely necessary to tell the reader the effect that such novel duties would be likely to produce among a group of Indian warriors, with whom it was a species of religious principle never to forget a benefit, or to forgive an injury. Fortunately, the previous explanations of Hist had prepared the minds of the Hurons for something extravagant, and most of that which to them seemed inconsistent and paradoxical was accounted for by the fact that the speaker possessed a mind that was constituted differently from those of most of the human race. Still, there were one or two old men who had heard similar doctrines from the missionaries, and these felt a desire to occupy an idle moment by pursuing a subject that they found so curious. "This is the good book of the pale faces," observed one of these chiefs, taking the volume from the unresisting hands of Hetty, who gazed anxiously at his face while he turned the leaves, as if she expected to witness some visible results from the circumstance. "This is the law by which my white brethren professes to live?" Hist, to whom this question was addressed, if it might be considered as addressed to any one in particular, answered simply in the affirmative, adding that both the French of the Canadas and the Yengeese of the British provinces equally admitted its authority, and affected to revere its principles. "Tell my young sister," said the Huron, looking directly at Hist, "that I will open my mouth and say a few words." "The Iroquois chief go to speak. My pale face friend listen," said Hist. "I rejoice to hear it!" exclaimed Hetty. "God has touched his heart, and he will now let father and Hurry go." "This is the pale face law," resumed the chief. "It tells him to do good to them that hurt him, and when his brother asks him for his rifle to give him the powder horn too. Such is the pale face law?" "Not so, not so," answered Hetty earnestly, when these words had been interpreted. "There is not a word about rifles in the whole book, and powder and bullets give offence to the Great Spirit. Why then does the pale face use them? If he is ordered to give double to him that asks only for one thing, why does he take double from the poor Indian who asks for no thing? He comes from beyond the rising sun, with this book in his hand, and he teaches the red man to read it. But why does he forget himself all it says? When the Indian gives, he is never satisfied, and now he offers gold for the scalps of our women and children, though he calls us beasts if we take the scalp of a warrior killed in open war. My name is Rivenoak." When Hetty had got this formidable question fairly presented to her mind in the translation, and Hist did her duty with more than usual readiness on this occasion, it scarcely need be said that she was sorely perplexed. Abler heads than that of this poor girl have frequently been puzzled by questions of a similar drift, and it is not surprising that with all her own earnestness and sincerity she did not know what answer to make. "What shall I tell them, Hist?" she asked imploringly. "I know that all I have read from the book is true, and yet it wouldn't seem so, would it, by the conduct of those to whom the book was given?" "Give 'em pale-face reason," returned Hist, ironically. "That always good for one side, though be bad for t'other." "No, no, Hist, there can't be two sides to truth, and yet it does seem strange. I'm certain I have read the verses right, and no one would be so wicked as to print the word of God wrong. That can never be, Hist." "Well, to poor Injin girl, it seem every thing can be to pale faces," returned the other coolly. "One time 'ey say white, and one time 'ey say black. Why never can be?" Hetty was more and more embarrassed, until, overcome with the apprehension that she had failed in her object, and that the lives of her father and Hurry would be the forfeit of some blunder of her own, she burst into tears. From that moment the manner of Hist lost all its irony and cool indifference, and she became the fond, caressing friend again. Throwing her arms around the afflicted girl, she attempted to soothe her sorrows by the scarcely ever failing remedy of female sympathy. "Stop cry no cry," she said, wiping the tears from the face of Hetty, as she would have performed the same office for a child, and stopping to press her occasionally to her own warm bosom with the affection of a sister. "Why you so trouble? You no make he book, if he be wrong, and you no make he pale face, if he wicked. There wicked red man, and wicked white man. No color all good, no color all wicked. Chiefs know that well enough." Hetty soon recovered from this sudden burst of grief, and then her mind reverted to the purpose of her visit, with all its single-hearted earnestness. Perceiving that the grim-looking chiefs were still standing around her in grave attention, she hoped that another effort to convince them of the right might be successful. "Listen, Hist," she said, struggling to suppress her sobs, and to speak distinctly. "Tell the chiefs that it matters not what the wicked do. Right is right. The words of the Great Spirit are the words of the Great Spirit, and no one can go harmless for doing an evil act, because another has done it before him. Render good for evil, says this book, and that is the law for the red man as well as for the white man." "Never hear such law among Delaware, or among Iroquois," answered Hist soothingly. "No good to tell chiefs any such laws as that. Tell 'em something they believe." Hist was about to proceed, notwithstanding, when a tap on the shoulder from the finger of the oldest chief caused her to look up. She then perceived that one of the warriors had left the group, and was already returning to it with Hutter and Hurry. Understanding that the two last were to become parties in the inquiry, she became mute, with the unhesitating obedience of an Indian woman. In a few seconds the prisoners stood face to face with the principal men of the captors. "Daughter," said the senior chief to the young Delaware, "ask this graybeard why he came into our camp." The question was put by Hist, in her own imperfect English, but in a way that was easy to be understood. Hutter was too stern and obdurate by nature to shrink from the consequences of any of his acts, and he was also too familiar with the opinions of the savages not to understand that nothing was to be gained by equivocation, or an unmanly dread of their anger. Without hesitating, therefore, he avowed the purpose with which he had landed, merely justifying it by the fact that the government of the province had bid high for scalps. This frank avowal was received by the Iroquois with evident satisfaction, not so much, however, on account of the advantage it gave them in a moral point of view, as by its proving that they had captured a man worthy of occupying their thoughts and of becoming a subject of their revenge. Hurry, when interrogated, confessed the truth, though he would have been more disposed to concealment than his sterner companion. did the circumstances very well admit of its adoption. But he had tact enough to discover that equivocation would be useless, at that moment, and he made a merit of necessity by imitating a frankness, which, in the case of Hutter, was the offspring of habits of indifference acting on a disposition that was always ruthless, and reckless of personal consequences. As soon as the chiefs had received the answers to their questions, they walked away in silence, like men who deemed the matter disposed of, all Hetty's dogmas being thrown away on beings trained in violence from infancy to manhood. Hetty and Hist were now left alone with Hutter and Hurry, no visible restraint being placed on the movements of either, though all four, in fact, were vigilantly and unceasingly watched. As respects the men, care was had to prevent them from getting possession of any of the rifles that lay scattered about, their own included, and where all open manifestations of watchfulness ceased. But they, who were so experienced in Indian practices, knew too well how great was the distance between appearances and reality, to become the dupes of this seeming carelessness. Although both thought incessantly of the means of escape, and this without concert, each was aware of the uselessness of attempting any project of the sort that was not deeply laid, and promptly executed. They had been long enough in the encampment, and were sufficiently observant to have ascertained that Hist, also, was a sort of captive, and presuming on the circumstance, Hutter spoke in her presence more openly than he might otherwise have thought it prudent to do, inducing Hurry to be equally unguarded by his example. "I'll not blame you, Hetty, for coming on this errand, which was well meant, if not very wisely planned," commenced the father, seating himself by the side of his daughter, and taking her hand, a sign of affection that this rude being was accustomed to manifest to this particular child. "But preaching, and the Bible, are not the means to turn an Indian from his ways. Has Deerslayer sent any message, or has he any scheme by which he thinks to get us free?" "Ay, that's the substance of it," put in Hurry. "If you can help us, gal, to half a mile of freedom, or even a good start of a short quarter, I'll answer for the rest. Perhaps the old man may want a little more, but for one of my height and years that will meet all objections." Hetty looked distressed, turning her eyes from one to the other, but she had no answer to give the question of the reckless Hurry. "Father," she said, "neither Deerslayer nor Judith knew of my coming until I had left the Ark. They are afraid the Iroquois will make a raft, and try to get off to the hut, and think more of defending that, than of coming to aid you." "No, no, no," said Hist hurriedly, though in a low voice, and with her face bent towards the earth, in order to conceal from those whom she knew to be watching them the fact of her speaking at all. "No, no, no. Deerslayer different man. He no t'ink of defending self, with friend in danger. Help one another, and all get to hut." "This sounds well, old Tom," said Hurry, winking and laughing, though he too used the precaution to speak low. "Give me a ready witted squaw for a fri'nd, and though I'll not downright defy an Iroquois, I think I would defy the devil." "No talk loud," said Hist. "Some Iroquois got Yengeese tongue, and all got Yengeese ear." "Have we a friend in you, young woman?" inquired Hutter, with an increasing interest in the conference. "If so, you may calculate on a solid reward, and nothing will be easier than to send you to your own tribe, if we can once fairly get you off with us to the castle. Give us the Ark and the canoes, and we can command the lake, spite of all the savages in the Canadas. Nothing but artillery could drive us out of the castle, if we can get back to it." "S'pose they come ashore to take scalp," retorted Hist, with cool irony, at which the girl appeared to be more expert than is common for her sex. "Ay, ay, that was a mistake. But there is little use in lamentations, and less still, young woman, in flings." "Father," said Hetty, "Judith thinks of breaking open the big chest, in hopes of finding something in that which may buy your freedom of the savages." A dark look came over Hutter at the announcement of this fact, and he muttered his dissatisfaction in a way to render it intelligible enough. "What for no break open chest?" put in Hist. "Life sweeter than old chest, scalp sweeter than old chest. If no tell darter to break him open, Wah ta Wah no help him to run away." "Ye know not what ye ask. Ye are but silly girls, and the wisest way for ye both is to speak of what ye understand, and to speak of nothing else. I little like this cold neglect of the savages, Hurry. It's a proof that they think of something serious, and if we are to do anything, we must do it soon. Can we count on this young woman, think you?" "Listen," said Hist quickly, and with an earnestness that proved how much her feelings were concerned. "Wah ta Wah no Iroquois. All over Delaware. Got Delaware heart, Delaware feeling. She prisoner, too. One prisoner help t'udder prisoner. No good to talk more now. Darter stay with fader, Wah ta Wah come and see friend. All look right, then tell what he do." This was said in a low voice, but distinctly, and in a manner to make an impression. As soon as it was uttered, the girl arose and left the group, walking composedly towards the hut she occupied, as if she had no further interest in what might pass between the pale-faces. Chapter 11. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 12. She speaks much of her father, says she hears there's tricks in the world, and hems and beats her breast, spurns enviously at straws, speaks things in doubt, that carry but half sense. Her speech is nothing, yet the unshaped use of it doth move the hearers to collection. Hamlet, Act 4, Scene 5, lines 4 through 9. We left the occupants of the castle and the ark buried in sleep. Once or twice, in the course of the night, it is true, Deerslayer or the Delaware arose and looked out upon the tranquil lake, when, finding all safe, each returned to his pallet, and slept like a man who was not easily deprived of his natural rest. At the first signs of the dawn the former arose, however, and made his personal arrangements for the day, though his companion, whose nights had not been tranquil or without disturbances of late, continued on his blanket until the sun had fairly risen. Judith, too, was later than common that morning, for the earlier hours of the night had brought her little of either refreshment or sleep. But ere the sun had shown himself over the eastern hills, these too were up and afoot, even the tardy in that region seldom remaining on their pallets after the appearance of the great luminary. Chingachgook was in the act of arranging his forest toilet, when Deerslayer entered the cabin of the ark, and threw him a few coarse but light summer vestments that belonged to Hutter. "Judith hath given me them for your use, chief," said the latter, as he cast the jacket and trousers at the feet of the Indian, "for it's ag'in all prudence and caution to be seen in your war dress and paint. Wash off all them fiery streaks from your cheeks. Put on these garments, and here is a hat, such as it is, that will give you an awful uncivilized sort of civilization, as the missionaries call it. Remember that Hist is at hand, and what we do for the maiden must be done while we are doing for others. I know it's ag'in your gifts and your natur' to wear clothes, unless they are cut and carried in a red man's fashion, but make a vartue of necessity and put these on at once, even if they do rise a little in your throat." Chingachgook, or the Serpent, eyed the vestments with strong disgust, but he saw the usefulness of the disguise, if not its absolute necessity. Should the Iroquois discover a red man in or about the castle, it might, indeed, place them more on their guard, and give their suspicions a direction towards their female captive. Anything was better than a failure, as it regarded his betrothed, and after turning the different garments round and round, examining them with a species of grave irony, affecting to draw them on in a way that defeated itself, and otherwise manifesting the reluctance of a young savage to confine his limbs in the usual appliances of civilized life, the chief submitted to the directions of his companion, and finally stood forth, so far as the eye could detect, a red man in color alone. Little was to be apprehended from this last peculiarity, however, the distance from the shore, and the want of glasses preventing any very close scrutiny, and Deerslayer himself, though of a brighter and fresher tint, had a countenance that was burnt by the sun to a hue scarcely less red than that of his Mohican companion. The awkwardness of the Delaware in his new attire caused his friend to smile more than once that day, but he carefully abstained from the use of any of those jokes which would have been bandied among white men on such an occasion. The habits of a chief, the dignity of a warrior on his first path, and the gravity of the circumstances in which they were placed, uniting to render so much levity out of season. The meeting at the morning meal of the three islanders, if we may use the term, was silent, grave, and thoughtful. Judith showed by her looks that she had passed an unquiet night, while the two men had the future before them, with its unseen and unknown events. A few words of courtesy passed between Deerslayer and the girl, in the course of the breakfast, but no allusion was made to their situation. At length, Judith, whose heart was full, and whose novel feelings disposed her to entertain sentiments more gentle and tender than common, introduced the subject, and this in a way to show how much of her thoughts it had occupied, in the course of the last sleepless night. "It would be dreadful, Deerslayer," the girl abruptly exclaimed, "should anything serious befall my father and Hetty. We cannot remain quietly here and leave them in the hands of the Iroquois, without bethinking us of some means of serving them." "I'm ready, Judith, to sarve them, and all others who are in trouble, could the way to do it be p'inted out. It's no trifling matter to fall into red skin hands, when men set out on an arrand like that which took Hutter and Hurry ashore. That I know as well as another, and I wouldn't wish my worst inimy in such a strait, much less them with whom I've journeyed, and eat, and slept. Have you any scheme, that you would like to have the Sarpent and me indivor to carry out?" "I know of no other means to release the prisoners, than by bribing the Iroquois. They are not proof against presents, and we might offer enough, perhaps, to make them think it better to carry away what to them will be rich gifts, than to carry away poor prisoners. If, indeed, they should carry them away at all." "This is well enough, Judith. Yes, it's well enough, if the inimy is to be bought, and we can find articles to make the purchase with. Your father has a convenient lodge, and it is most cunningly placed, though it doesn't seem overstocked with riches that will be likely to buy his ransom. There's the piece he calls killdeer, might count for something, and I understand there's a keg of powder about, which might be a make-weight sartain. And yet 2 able-bodied men are not to be bought off for a trifle. Besides—" "Besides what?" demanded Judith impatiently, observing that the other hesitated to proceed, probably from a reluctance to distress her. "Why, Judith, the Frenchers offer bounties as well as our own side, and the price of 2 scalps would purchase a keg of powder, and a rifle, though I'll not say one of the latter altogether as good as killdeer, there, which your father vaunts as uncommon and unequalled, like, but fair powder, and a pretty sartain rifle. Then the red men are not the expartest in firearms, and don't always know the difference atwixt that which is ra'al, and that which is seeming." "This is horrible," muttered the girl, struck by the homely manner in which her companion was accustomed to state his facts. "But you overlook my own clothes, Deerslayer, and they, I think, might go far with the women of the Iroquois." "No doubt they would, no doubt they would, Judith," returned the other, looking at her keenly, as if he would ascertain whether she were really capable of making such a sacrifice. "But are you sartain, gal, you could find it in your heart to part with your own finery for such a purpose? Many is the man who has thought he was valiant, till danger stared him in the face. I've known them, too, that consaited they were kind and ready to give away all they had to the poor, when they've been listening to other people's hard-heartedness, but whose fists have clenched as tight as the riven hickory when it came to downright offerings of their own. Besides, Judith, you're handsome, uncommon in that way, one might observe, and do no harm to the truth, and they that have beauty like to have that which will adorn it. Are you sartain you could find it in your heart to part with your own finery?" The soothing allusion to the personal charms of the girl was well timed, to counteract the effect produced by the distrust that the young man expressed of Judith's devotion to her filial duties. Had another said as much as Deerslayer, the compliment would most probably have been overlooked in the indignation awakened by the doubts. But even the unpolished sincerity, that so often made this simple-minded hunter bare his thoughts, had a charm for the girl, and while she colored, and for an instant her eyes flashed fire, she could not find it in her heart to be really angry with one whose very soul seemed truth and manly kindness. Look her reproaches she did, but conquering the desire to retort, she succeeded in answering in a mild and friendly manner. You must keep all your favorable opinions for the Delaware girls, Deerslayer, if you seriously think thus of those of your own color," she said, affecting to laugh. "But try me. If you find that I regret either ribbon or feather, silk or muslin, then may you think what you please of my heart, and say what you think." "That's justice. The rarest thing to find on 'arth is a truly just man. So says Tamenund, the wisest prophet of the Delawares, and so all must think that have occasion to see, and talk, and act among mankind. I love a just man, Sarpent. His eyes are never covered with darkness towards his inimies, while they are all sunshine and brightness towards his fri'nds. He uses the reason that God has given him, and he uses it with a feelin' of his being ordered to look at, and to consider things as they are, and not as he wants them to be. It's easy enough to find men who call themselves just, but it's wonderful oncommon to find them that are the very thing, in fact. How often have I seen Indians, gal, who believed they were lookin' into a matter agreeable to the will of the Great Spirit, when in truth they were only striving to act up to their own will and pleasure, and this, half the time, with a temptation to go wrong that could no more be seen by themselves than the stream that runs in the next valley can be seen by us through yonder mountain, though any looker on may have discovered it as plainly as we can discover the parch that are swimming around this hut." "Very true, Deerslayer," rejoined Judith, losing every trace of displeasure in a bright smile. "Very true, and I hope to see you act on this love of justice in all matters in which I am concerned. Above all, I hope you will judge for yourself, and not believe every evil story that a prating idler like Hurry Harry may have to tell, that goes to touch the good name of any young woman, who may not happen to have the same opinion of his face and person that the blustering gallant has of himself. Hurry Harry's idees do not pass for gospel with me, Judith. But even worse than he may have eyes and ears," returned the other gravely. "Enough of this," exclaimed Judith, with flashing eye and a flush that mounted to her temples, "and more of my father and his ransom. 'Tis as you say, Deerslayer, the Indians will not be likely to give up their prisoners without a heavier bribe than my clothes can offer, and father's rifle and powder. There is the chest." "Ay, there is the chest, as you say, Judith, and when the question gets to be between a secret and a scalp, I should think most men would prefer keeping the last. Did your father ever give you any downright commands consarning that chist?" "Never. He has always appeared to think its locks and its steel bands and its strength its best protection." "'Tis a rare chest, and altogether of curious build," returned Deerslayer, rising and approaching the thing in question, on which he seated himself with a view to examine it with greater ease. "Chingachgook, this is no wood that comes of any forest that you or I have ever trailed through. 'Tisn't the black walnut, and yet it's quite as comely, if not more so, did the smoke and the treatment give it fair play." The Delaware drew near, felt of the wood, examined its grain, endeavored to indent the surface with a nail, and passed his hand curiously over the steel bands, the heavy padlocks, and the other novel peculiarities of the massive box. "No, nothing like this grows in these regions," resumed Deerslayer. "I've seen all the oaks, both the maples, the elms, the basswoods, all the walnuts, the butternuts, and every tree that has a substance and color, wrought into some form or other, but never have I before seen such a wood as this. Judith, the chest itself would buy your father's freedom, or Iroquois curiosity isn't as strong as red skin curiosity, in general, especially in the matter of woods." "The purchase might be cheaper made, perhaps, Deerslayer. The chest is full, and it would be better to part with half than to part with the whole. Besides, father, I know not why, but father values that chest highly." "He would seem to prize what it holds more than the chest itself, judging by the manner in which he treats the outside, and secures the inside. Here are 3 locks, Judith. Is there no key?" "I've never seen one, and yet key there must be, since Hetty told us she had often seen the chest opened." "Keys no more lie in the air, or float in the water, than humans, gal. If there is a key, there must be a place in which it is kept." "That is true, and it might not be difficult to find it, did we dare to search. This is for you, Judith. It is altogether for you. The chist is your'n, or your father's, and Hutter is your father, not mine. Curiosity is a woman's, and not a man's failing, and there you have got all the reasons before you. If the chist has articles for ransom, it seems to me they would be wisely used in redeeming their owner's life, or even in saving his scalp, but that is a matter for your judgment, and not for our'n. When the lawful owner of a trap, or a buck, or a canoe isn't present, his next of kin becomes his riprisentive by all the laws of the woods. We therefore leave you to say whether the chist shall or shall not be opened." "I hope you do not believe I can hesitate, when my father's life's in danger, Deerslayer." "Why, it's pretty much putting a scolding ag'in tears and mourning. It's not unreasonable to foretell that old Tom may find fault with what you've done, when he sees himself once more in his hut, here. But there's nothing unusual in men's falling out with what has been done for their own good. I dare to say that even the moon would seem a different thing from what it now does, could we look at it from the other side. Deerslayer, if we can find the key, I will authorize you to open the chest, and to take such things from it as you may think will buy father's ransom." "First find the key, gal. We'll talk of the rest a'terwards. Sarpent, you've eyes like a fly, and a judgment that's seldom out. Can you help us in calculating where Floating Tom would be apt to keep the key of a chist that he holds to be as private as this?" The Delaware had taken no part in the discourse, until he was thus directly appealed to, when he quitted the chest, which had continued to attract his attention, and cast about him for the place in which a key would be likely to be concealed under such circumstances. As Judith and Deerslayer were not idle the while, the whole three were soon engaged in an anxious and spirited search. As it was certain that the desired key was not to be found in any of the common drawers or closets, of which there were several in the building, none looked there, but all turned their inquiries to those places that struck them as ingenious hiding places, and more likely to be used for such a purpose. In this manner, the outer room was thoroughly but fruitlessly examined, when they entered the sleeping apartment of Hutter. This part of the rude building was better furnished than the rest of the structure, containing several articles that had been especially devoted to the service of the deceased wife of its owner. But as Judith had all the rest of the keys, it was soon rummaged without bringing to light the particular key desired. They now entered the bedroom of the daughters. Chingachgook was immediately struck with the contrast between the articles and the arrangement of that side of the room that might be called Judith's, and that which more properly belonged to Hetty. A slight exclamation escaped him, and pointing in each direction, he alluded to the fact in a low voice, speaking to his friend in the Delaware tongue. "'Tis as you think, Sarpent," answered Deerslayer, whose remarks we always translate into English, preserving as much as possible of the peculiar phraseology and manner of the man. "'Tis just so, as any one may see, and 'tis all founded in natur'. One sister loves finery, some say overmuch, while t'other is as meek and lowly as God ever created goodness and truth. Yet, after all, I dare say that Judith has her vartues, and Hetty has her failin's." "And the Feeble Mind has seen the chist opened?" inquired Chingachgook with curiosity in his glance. "Sartain. That much I've heard from her own lips; and for that matter, so have you. It seems her father doesn't misgive her discretion, though he does that of his eldest darter. Then the key is hid only from the Wild Rose?" For so Chingachgook had begun gallantly to term Judith in his private discourse with his friend. "That's it. That's just it. One he trusts, and the other he doesn't. There's red and white in that, Sarpent, all tribes and nations agreeing in trusting some, and refusing to trust other some. It depends on character and judgment." Where could a key be put so little likely to be found by the Wild Rose, as among coarse clothes? Deerslayer started, and turning to his friend with admiration expressed in every lineament of his face, he fairly laughed, in his silent but hearty manner, at the ingenuity and readiness of the conjecture. "Your name's well bestowed, Sarpent; yes, 'tis well bestowed, sure enough. Where would a lover of finery be so little likely to s'arch, as among garments as coarse and unseemly as these of poor Hetty's? I dares to say, Judith's delicate fingers haven't touched a bit of cloth as rough and uncomely as that petticoat, now, since she first made acquaintance with the officers. Yet who knows? The key may be as likely to be on the same peg as in any other place. Take down the garment, Delaware, and let us see if you are ra'ally a prophet." Chingachgook did as desired, but no key was found. A coarse pocket, apparently empty, hung on the adjoining peg, and this was next examined. By this time, the attention of Judith was called in that direction, and she spoke hurriedly, and like one who wished to save unnecessary trouble. "Those are only the clothes of poor Hetty, dear simple girl," she said. "Nothing we seek would be likely to be there." The words were hardly out of the handsome mouth of the speaker, when Chingachgook drew the desired key from the pocket. Judith was too quick of apprehension not to understand the reason a hiding place so simple and exposed had been used. The blood rushed to her face, as much with resentment, perhaps, as with shame, and she bit her lip, though she continued silent. Deerslayer and his friend now discovered the delicacy of men of native refinement, neither smiling, nor even by a glance betraying how completely he understood the motives and ingenuity of this clever artifice. The former, who had taken the key from the Indian, led the way into the adjoining room, and applying it to a lock ascertained that the right instrument had actually been found. There were 3 padlocks, each of which, however, was easily opened by this single key. Deerslayer removed them all, loosened the hasps, raised the lid a little to make certain it was loose, and then he drew back from the chest several feet, signing to his friend to follow. "This is a family chist, Judith," he said, "and 'tis like to hold family secrets. The Sarpent and I will go into the Ark, and look to the canoes, and paddles, and oars, while you can examine it by yourself, and find out whether anything that will be a make-weight in a ransom is, or is not, among the articles. When you've got through, give us a call, and we'll all sit in council together, touching the valie of the articles." "Stop, Deerslayer," exclaimed the girl, as he was about to withdraw. "Not a single thing will I touch. I will not even raise the lid, unless you are present. Father and Hetty have seen fit to keep the inside of this chest a secret from me, and I am much too proud to pry into their hidden treasures, unless it were for their own good. But on no account will I open the chest alone. Stay with me, then. I want witnesses of what I do." "I rather think, Sarpent, that the gal is right. Confidence and reliance beget security, but suspicion is like to make us all wary. Judith has a right to ask us to be present, and should the chist hold any of Master Hutter's secrets, they will fall into the keeping of 2 as close-mouthed young men as are to be found. We will stay with you, Judith, but first let us take a look at the lake and the shore, for this chist will not be emptied in a minute." The 2 men now went out on the platform, and Deerslayer swept the shore with the glass, while the Indian gravely turned his eye on the water and the woods, in quest of any sign that might betray the machinations of their enemies. Nothing was visible, and assured of their temporary security, the 3 collected around the chest again, with the avowed object of opening it. Judith had held this chest and its unknown contents in a species of reverence as long as she could remember. Neither her father nor her mother ever mentioned it in her presence, and there appeared to be a silent convention that, in naming the different objects that occasionally stood near it, or even lay on its lid, care should be had to avoid any allusion to the chest itself. Habit had rendered this so easy, and so much a matter of course, that it was only quite recently the girl had began even to muse on the singularity of the circumstance. But there had never been sufficient intimacy between Hutter and his eldest daughter to invite confidence. At times he was kind, but in general, with her more especially, he was stern and morose. Least of all had his authority been exercised in a way to embolden his child to venture on the liberty she was about to take, without many misgivings of the consequences, although the liberty proceeded from a desire to serve himself. Then Judith was not altogether free from a little superstition on the subject of this chest, which had stood a sort of tabooed relic before her eyes from childhood to the present hour. Nevertheless, the time had come when it would seem that this mystery was to be explained, and that, under circumstances, too, which left her very little choice in the matter. Finding that both her companions were watching her movements, in grave silence, Judith placed a hand on the lid, and endeavored to raise it. Her strength, however, was insufficient, and it appeared to the girl, who was fully aware that all the fastenings were removed, that she was resisted in an unhallowed attempt by some supernatural power. "I cannot raise the lid, Deerslayer," she said. "Had we not better give up the attempt, and find some other means of releasing the prisoners?" "Not so, Judith, not so, gal. No means are as sartain and easy as a good bribe," answered the other. "As for the lid, 'tis held by nothing but its own weight, which is prodigious for so small a piece of wood, loaded with iron as it is." As Deerslayer spoke, he applied his own strength to the effort, and succeeded in raising the lid against the timbers of the house, where he took care to secure it by a sufficient prop. Judith fairly trembled as she cast her first glance at the interior, and she felt a temporary relief in discovering that a piece of canvas, that was carefully tucked in around the edges, effectually concealed all beneath it. The chest was apparently well stored, however, the canvas lying within an inch of the lid. "Here's a full cargo," said Deerslayer, eyeing the arrangement, "and we had needs go to work leisurely, and at our ease. Sarpent, bring some stools, while I spread this blanket on the floor, and then we'll begin work orderly and in comfort." The Delaware complied. Deerslayer civilly placed a stool for Judith, took one himself, and commenced the removal of the canvas covering. This was done deliberately, and in as cautious a manner as if it were believed that the fabrics of a delicate construction lay hidden beneath. When the canvas was removed, the first articles that came in view were some of the habiliments of the male sex. They were of fine materials, and according to the fashions of the age, were gay in colors and rich in ornaments. One coat in particular was of scarlet, and had button holes worked in gold thread. Still it was not military, but was part of the attire of a civilian of condition, at a period when social rank was rigidly respected in dress. Chingachgook could not refrain from an exclamation of pleasure as soon as Deerslayer opened this coat and held it up to view, for, notwithstanding all his trained self-command, the splendor of the vestment was too much for the philosophy of an Indian. Deerslayer turned quickly, and he regarded his friend with momentary displeasure as this burst of weakness escaped him, and then he soliloquized, as was his practice whenever any strong feeling suddenly got the ascendancy. "'Tis his gift, yes. 'Tis the gift of a red skin to love finery, and he is not to be blamed. This is an extr'ornary garment, too, and extr'ornary things get up extr'ornary feelin's. I think this will do, Judith, for the Indian heart is hardly to be found in all America that can withstand colors like these, and glitter like that. If this coat was ever made for your father, you've come honestly by the taste for finery, you have." "That coat was never made for father," answered the girl quickly. "It is much too long, while father is short and square." "Cloth was plenty if it was, and glitter cheap," answered Deerslayer, with his silent, joyous laugh. "Sarpent, this garment was made for a man of your size, and I should like to see it on your shoulders." Chingachgook, nothing loath, submitted to the trial, throwing aside the coarse and threadbare jacket of Hutter, to deck his person in a coat that was originally intended for a gentleman. The transformation was ludicrous, but as men are seldom struck with incongruities in their own appearance, any more than in their own conduct, the Delaware studied this change in a common glass, by which Hutter was in the habit of shaving, with grave interest. At that moment he thought of Hist, and we owe it to truth to say, though it may militate a little against the stern character of a warrior to avow it, that he wished he could be seen by her in his present improved aspect. "Off with it, Sarpent, off with it," resumed the inflexible Deerslayer. "Such garments as little become you as they would become me. Your gifts are for paint, and hawk's feathers, and blankets, and wampum, and mine are for doublets of skins, tough leggings, and sarviceable moccasins. I say moccasins, Judith, for though white, Living as I do in the woods, it's necessary to take some of the practices of the woods, for comfort's sake and cheapness." "I see no reason, Deerslayer, why one man may not wear a scarlet coat as well as another," returned the girl. "I wish I could see you in this handsome garment." "See me in a coat fit for a lord? Well, Judith, if you wait till that day, you'll wait until you see me beyond reason and memory. No, no, gal, my gifts are my gifts, and I'll live and die in 'em, though I never bring down another deer, or spear another salmon. What have I done that you should wish to see me in such a flaunting coat, Judith?" "Because I think, Deerslayer, that the false-tongued and false-hearted young gallants of the garrisons ought not alone appear in fine feathers, but that truth and honesty have their claims to be honored and exalted." And what exaltification, the reader will have remarked that Deerslayer had not very critically studied his dictionary, and what exaltification would it be to me, Judith, to be bedizened and bescarleted like a Mingo chief that has just got his presents up from Quebec? No, no, I'm well as I am, and if not, I can be no better. Lay the coat down on the blanket, Sarpent, and let us look farther into the chist." The tempting garment, one surely that was never intended for Hutter, was laid aside, and the examination proceeded. The male attire, all of which corresponded with the coat in quality, was soon exhausted, and then succeeded female. A beautiful dress of brocade, a little the worse from negligent treatment, followed, and this time open exclamations of delight escaped the lips of Judith. Much as the girl had been addicted to dress, and favorable as had been her opportunities of seeing some little pretension in that way among the wives of the different commandants, and other ladies of the forts, never before had she beheld a tissue or tints to equal those that were now so unexpectedly placed before her eyes. Her rapture was almost childish, nor would she allow the inquiry to proceed, until she had attired her person in a robe so unsuited to her habits and her abode. With this end she withdrew into her own room, where, with hands practised in such offices, she soon got rid of her own neat gown of linen, and stood forth in the gay tints of the brocade. The dress happened to fit the fine, full person of Judith, and certainly it had never adorned a being better qualified by natural gifts to do credit to its really rich hues and fine texture. When she returned, both Deerslayer and Chingachgook, who had passed the brief time of her absence in taking a second look at the male garments, arose in surprise, each permitting exclamations of wonder and pleasure to escape him, in a way so unequivocal as to add new lustre to the eyes of Judith, by flushing her cheeks with a glow of triumph. Affecting, however, not to notice the impression she had made, the girl seated herself with the stateliness of a queen, desiring that the chest might be looked into further. "I don't know a better way to treat with the Mingos, gal," cried Deerslayer, "than to send you ashore as you be, and to tell 'em that a queen has arrived among 'em. They'll give up old Hutter, and Hurry, and Hetty too, at such a spectacle." "I thought your tongue too honest to flatter, Deerslayer," returned the girl, gratified at this admiration more than she would have cared to own. "One of the chief reasons of my respect for you was your love for truth." "And 'tis truth, and solemn truth, Judith, and nothing else. Never did eyes of mine gaze on as glorious a lookin' creatur' as you be yourself, at this very moment. I've seen beauties in my time, too, both white and red, and them that was renowned and talked of, far and near, but never have I beheld one that could hold any comparison with what you are at this blessed instant, Judith. Never." The glance of delight which the girl bestowed on the frank-speaking hunter in no degree lessened the effect of her charms, and as the humid eyes blended with it a look of sensibility, perhaps Judith never appeared more truly lovely than at what the young man had called that blessed instant. He shook his head, held it suspended a moment over the open chest, like one in doubt, and then proceeded with the examination. Several of the minor articles of female dress came next, all of a quality to correspond with the gown. These were laid at Judith's feet, in silence, as if she had a natural claim to their possession. One or two, such as gloves and lace, the girl caught up, and appended to her already rich attire in affected playfulness, but with the real design of decorating her person as far as circumstances would allow. When these two remarkable suits, male and female they might be termed, were removed, another canvas covering separated the remainder of the articles from the part of the chest which they had occupied. As soon as Deerslayer perceived this arrangement he paused, doubtful of the propriety of proceeding any further. "Every man has his secrets, I suppose," he said, "and all men have a right to their enj'yment. We've got low enough in this chist, in my judgment, to answer our wants, and it seems to me we should do well by going no farther, and by letting Master Hutter have to himself, and his own feelin's, all that's beneath this cover." "Do you mean, Deerslayer, to offer these clothes to the Iroquois as ransom?" demanded Judith quickly. "Sartain. What are we prying into another man's chist for, but to sarve its owner in the best way we can? This coat alone would be very apt to gain over the head chief of the riptyles, and if his wife or darter should happen to be out with him, that there gownd would soften the heart of any woman that is to be found between Albany and Montreal. I do not see that we want a larger stock in trade than them two articles. But of what use could a dress like this be to any Indian woman? She could not wear it among the branches of the trees, the dirt and smoke of the wigwam would soon soil it, and how would a pair of red arms appear, thrust through these short laced sleeves?" "All very true, gal, and you might go on and say it is altogether out of time, and place, and season, in this region at all. What is it to us how the finery is treated, so long as it answers our wishes? I do not see that your father can make any use of such clothes, and it's lucky he has things that are of no valie to himself, that will bear a high price with others. We can make no better trade for him, than to offer these duds for his liberty. We'll throw in the light frivolities, and get Hurry off in the bargain." "Then you think, Deerslayer, that Thomas Hutter has no one in his family, no child, no daughter to whom this dress may be thought becoming, and whom you could wish to see in it once in a while, even though it should be at long intervals, and only in playfulness?" "I understand you, Judith. Yes, I now understand your meaning, and I think I can say, your wishes. That you are as glorious in that dress as the sun when it rises or sets in a soft October day, I'm ready to allow; and that you greatly become it is a good deal more sartain than that it becomes you. There's gifts in clothes, as well as in other things. Now I do not think that a warrior on his first path ought to lay on the same awful paints as a chief that has had his virtue tried, and knows from experience he will not disgrace his pretensions. So it is with all of us, red or white. You are Thomas Hutter's darter, and that gownd was made for the child of some governor, or a lady of high station, and it was intended to be worn among fine furniture, and in rich company. In my eyes, Judith, a modest maiden never looks more becoming than when becomingly clad, and nothing is suitable that is out of character. Besides, gal, if there's a creatur' in the colony that can afford to do without finery, and to trust to her own good looks and sweet countenance, it's yourself." "I'll take off the rubbish this instant, Deerslayer," cried the girl, springing up to leave the room, "and never do I wish to see it on any human being again." "So it is with 'em all, Sarpent," said the other, turning to his friend and laughing, as soon as the beauty had disappeared. "They like finery, but they like their natyve charms most of all. I'm glad the gal has consented to lay aside her furbelows, howsever, for it's ag'in reason for one of her class to wear 'em, and then she is handsome enough, as I call it, to go alone. Hist would show uncommon likely, too, in such a gownd, Delaware." "Wah-ta-Wah is a red skin girl, Deerslayer," returned the Indian. "Like the young of the pigeon, she is to be known by her own feathers. I should pass by without knowing her, were she dressed in such a skin. It's wisest always to be so clad that our friends need not ask us our names. The wild rose is very pleasant, but she is no sweeter for so many colors." "That's it. That's natur', and the true foundation for love and protection. When a man stoops to pick a wild strawberry, he does not expect to find a melon, and when he wishes to gather a melon, he's disapp'inted if it proves to be a squash, though squashes be often brighter to the eye than melons. That's it, and it means stick to your gifts, and your gifts will stick to you." The two men had now a little discussion together, touching the propriety of penetrating any farther into the chest of Hutter, when Judith reappeared, divested of her robes, and in her own simple linen frock again. "Thank you, Judith," said Deerslayer, taking her kindly by the hand, for I know it went a little ag'in the natural cravings of woman to lay aside so much finery, as it might be in a lump. But you're more pleasing to the eye as you stand, you be, than if you had a crown on your head, and jewels dangling from your hair. The question now is, whether to lift this covering to see what will be ra'ally the best bargain we can make for Master Hutter, for we must do as we think he would be willing to do, did he stand here in our places." Judith looked very happy. Accustomed as she was to adulation, the homely homage of Deerslayer had given her more true satisfaction than she had ever yet received from the tongue of man. It was not the terms in which this admiration had been expressed, for they were simple enough, that produced so strong an impression, nor yet their novelty, or their warmth of manner, nor any of those peculiarities that usually give value to praise, but the unflinching truth of the speaker, that carried his words so directly to the heart of the listener. This is one of the great advantages of plain dealing and frankness. The habitual and wily flatterer may succeed until his practices recoil on himself, and like other sweets, his aliment cloys its excess. But he who deals honestly, though he often necessarily offends, possesses a power of praising that no quality but sincerity can bestow, since his words go directly to the heart, finding their support in the understanding. Thus it was with Deerslayer and Judith. So soon and so deeply did this simple hunter impress those who knew him with a conviction of his unending honesty, that all he uttered in commendation was as certain to please, as all he uttered in the way of rebuke was as certain to rankle and excite enmity, where his character had not awakened a respect and affection, that in another sense rendered it painful. In after life, when the career of this untutored being brought him in contact with officers of rank, and others entrusted with the care of the interests of the state, this same influence was exerted on a wider field, even generals listening to his commendations with a glow of pleasure, that it was not always in the power of their official superiors to awaken. Perhaps Judith was the first individual of his own color who fairly submitted to this natural consequence of truth and fair dealing on the part of Deerslayer. She had actually pined for his praise, and she had now received it, and that in the form which was most agreeable to her weaknesses and habits of thought. The result will appear in the course of the narrative. "If we knew all that chest holds, Deerslayer," returned the girl, when she had a little recovered from the immediate effect produced by his commendations of her personal appearance, "we could better determine on the course we ought to take." "That's not unreasonable, gal, though it's more a pale face than a red skin gift to be prying into other people's secrets. Curiosity is natural, and it is expected that all human beings should have human failings. Whenever I've been at the garrisons, I've found that most in and about them had a longing to learn their neighbors' secrets. Yes, and sometimes to fancy them, when they couldn't find 'em out. That's the difference between an Indian gentleman and a white gentleman. The Sarpent, here, would turn his head aside, if he found himself unknowingly looking into another chief's wigwam, whereas in the settlements, while all pretend to be great people, most prove they've got betters, by the manner in which they talk of their consarns. I'll be bound, Judith, you wouldn't get the Sarpent, there, to confess there was another in the tribe so much greater than himself, as to become the subject of his idees, and to employ his tongue in conversations about his movements, and ways, and food, and all the other little matters that occupy a man when he's not empl'yed in his greater duties. He who does this is but little better than a blackguard in the grain, and them that encourages him is pretty much of the same kidney, let them wear coats as fine as they may, or of what dye they please. But this is not another man's wigwam. It belongs to my father. These are his things, and they are wanted in his service." "That's true, gal, that's true, and it carries weight with it. Well, when all is before us, we may, indeed, best judge which to offer for the ransom, and which to withhold." Judith was not altogether as disinterested in her feelings as she affected to be. She remembered that the curiosity of Hetty had been indulged in connection with this chest, while her own had been disregarded, and she was not sorry to possess an opportunity of being placed on a level with her less gifted sister in this one particular, it appearing to be admitted all round that the inquiry into the contents of the chest ought to be renewed. Deerslayer proceeded to remove the second covering of canvas. The articles that lay uppermost, when the curtain was again raised on the secrets of the chest, were a pair of pistols, curiously inlaid with silver. Their value would have been considerable in one of the towns, though as weapons in the woods they were a species of arms seldom employed. Never, indeed, unless it might be by some officer from Europe, who visited the colonies, as many were then wont to do, so much impressed with the superiority of the usages of London as to fancy they were not to be laid aside on the frontiers of America. What occurred on the discovery of these weapons will appear in the succeeding chapter. Chapter XIII. Recording by Bill Borst.